Hey y'all, howdy. Welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandy Broadwell, and today we're gonna get nitty gritty. We're gonna get down into the business. We're gonna talk about all of my reading stats for 2024. So everything you never needed to know about the numbers. I am a nerd. I love this kind of shit, so buckle up. If this is your thing, we're gonna get into it. I read 86 books this year, so there's stat number one. 86 books, and it was a great reading year. My most read authors, I'm gonna be looking down at my screen, but I'll flash them on the screen for you guys so that you don't have to look at me looking at the screen the entire time. My most read author this year was Martha Wells. I read the entire Murderbot series this year. That was 7 books, but those are all novellas, so 7 books really isn't that much. I have 3 other authors that I read 5 books by this year, and that is Nevo, Joe Abercrombie, and Brandon Sanderson. I read the entire Singing Hills cycle, I finished off the First Law World, and I read the entire Stormlight Archive for the very first time. So those were all great experiences. If you want to see my best books of the year video where I go into depth about some of the very books that are on the screen, you can see that in my last video, which I will link below. Then I had 2 authors that I read 4 books by this year. That is Ken Liu and Mark Lawrence. Ken Liu because I read the entire Dandelion Dynasty, and Mark Lawrence because I read the Book of the Ice series, and then I also read book 2 of the Library Trilogy. And then the only other complete trilogy that I read this year was the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden, which was absolutely fantastic. And then I have 6 authors that I read 2 books by this year, and that is P. Djeli Clark, who I actually got to meet at a book tour event this year, which was super cool. I have a video about that as well that I'll link below. And then I finished off the Burning Kingdoms trilogy by Tasha Suri. I started the Sun Eater trilogy by Christopher Rocchio. I had a bit of a rocky road with that one, but I am planning to continue. I read the Carl's duology by Hank Green, which was a fun time. I also read the Earthseed duology by Octavia E. Butler, and I read the first 2 books of The Forever Desert by Moses Oze Utomi. So those are my most read authors. As far as the books and pages, I guess I took the screenshot before I had finished my very last book of the year, but this says I read 34,466 pages, which averages out to about 2,872 pages per month, or about 7 books per month. That I think feels pretty good. Most number of books that I read was in January and February this past year, and that was because that's when I was reading a lot of Murderbot and other novellas. And my most number of pages read this year was in June, and that's because that's when I read like the entire Dandelion Dynasty in a month. So that was a fun time. Then moving on, I'm gonna dive into all of the different genres that I read and every single book, and how the genres break down this year. So obviously, starting with my most read genre is going to be fantasy. I have 40 fantasy books that I read this year, and fantasy will probably always and forever be my most read genre. It is the love of my heart. My second most read genre, also not a surprise, is science fiction, which again will probably always be my second most read genre of every single year, and that is 24 different science fiction novels this year. And a lot of ups and downs on this page for sure, but definitely some good wins. And then my third most common genre this year was horror. I read 7 horror books in 2024. I think We Spread is probably my favorite of this page, but that's a hard call. There's actually, I really liked a lot of these horror books. That one has a lot of wins on this page. Then as for nonfiction, I read 6 nonfiction books and 1 poetry. One of my best books of the year is on this page, so hint hint, go watch my best books of the year video. And then I have just like a miscellaneous page for all the other books that I read, which is a little bit of literary fiction, historical fiction, classics, a mystery, a thriller, all of that sort of stuff just kind of falls on this this page because I didn't have more than 1 or 2 of each of those. So that's all of the books that I read in 2024. I read 17 new releases in 2024. I had really good success with new releases this year. Not all of them were wins, but I would say I'm very happy that I read most of these, and some of my absolute favorite books of the year are new releases, so that's exciting. So let's break it down a little bit more by the numbers, moving past just books that I read. Completed series by page count. So even though I talked about my most read authors and you saw some of the series that I read in there, which ones really took up the breadth of the reading? And that's obviously this from my archive, 6,127 pages split up between 5 books. That was a big chonker this year. Then we have the Dandelion Dynasty, 4 books, 3,579 pages. And then the Burning Kingdoms trilogy, I did go ahead and include the whole trilogy in here, even though I only read 2 of the books this year because I read the Jasmine Throne last year, but just so you can see kind of how it stacks up among the other series in terms of its length. The Age of Madness trilogy, then the Book of Ice. The Winter Night trilogy is the shortest trilogy that I read this year, and I want to figure out how Catherine Arden does that. I love authors that can tell such a moving story in a short amount of words. I don't know how they do it. I'm more of a Brandon Sanderson type writer where I just I have a lot to say. And then the 2 duologies that I read this year, The Carls and Earthseed, were both short. So books in a series versus standalones. The majority of the books that I read this year were books in a series, 51, and 34 books that were just standalones. Then how I acquired these books. If you've been following this channel for a while, you know I was a van lifer with my husband for the majority of 2024. And so most of the books that I read this year, I actually checked out from the library via the Libby app on my phone and then sent those books to my Kindle. So I e-read most of my books, and that was mostly thank you to the Libby app. So definitely check out the Libby app if you haven't used it before and support your local library. Then 14 books I got from an indie bookstore. 10 books I either purchased from Amazon or KU. I actually just did a free trial of KU, I think back in January, because I found out that the Murderbot series was all on KU, and so most of, I think actually the only KU books that I read this year were Murderbot, and then when I finished that series, I just canceled my free trial of Kindle Unlimited. But I also bought a few books from Amazon this year. And then 8 books that I read this year were gifted to me either for my birthday or Christmas. 5 I have just an other category because there was random things, random ways that I got books, like a Kickstarter or a pre-order from a one-off website, or random things like that. And then I bought 3 books from a chain bookstore, and I picked up 2 books from a little free library. So that's how I got all of my books this year. Moving on, we'll talk about what percentage of my books were new versus old. Like I mentioned, 17 books were new releases this year, so that was 20% of my overall reading. As you can see, the majority, over 50% of my books, were released within the last 5 years since 2020, so that's a huge chunk of my reading. And then 24% of my reading was published between 2015 and 2019, and then before 2015, really a small, very small amount of my reading. 8% of the books that I read this year were published between 2010 and 2014. I think only read 1 book that was published between the years 2000 and 2009. And then I read 3 books that were published from 1999 to 1900 and 3 books that were published in the 1800s. I also read Don Quixote this year, which was published in the 1600s, but I DNF'd Don Quixote, even though I'm counting it as a book read because I read 75% of it. Anyway, one of my goals for this year was to prioritize new releases. My goal was to read at least 10 new releases in 2024, and I read 17 of them, so that's great because last year I read, I think, only 3 new releases. Then author demographics. I have this broken down by sex and by race, and for that I just have BIPOC to mean basically any non-white author. And so the majority of the books that I read, 36%, were by white men this year, which is a trend that I can't seem to shake. 29% of the books that I read this year were by white women, 16% by non-white men, 18% by non-white women, and then 1% of the books that I read were by non-binary BIPOC authors. So yeah, total of 85 books and 54 authors included in this graph. And then 74% of the authors that I read this year were from the United States, and 26% were international authors, whether that was just Canada or England or Australia, or whether it was actually non-English speaking countries. I didn't keep track of which countries other than just United States, yes or no, basically. I made a community post asking people what stats they were interested in, and I did have someone ask how many books that I read this year were translated or not originally published in English, and I think it was only 2, and those were the 2 books that I have talked about frequently as having DNF'd this year. So Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes and 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami, which would have originally been published in Japanese. I also DNF'd. So I definitely need to get better about reading translated works. I read a lot more translated works in 2023. I don't know why those didn't end up on my TBR this year. It is what it is. And then, have I read from these authors before? I included every author that I read from this year only one time on this graph, and 74% of the authors that I read this year were brand new to me, had never read any of their books before. And then 26% of the authors were repeat authors that I knew that I loved and was coming back to for some more. As far as the format, like I mentioned, most of the books that I read this year were Libby checkouts, and so I read 60 ebooks, and then the rest were physical books. I read 19 paperbacks and 6 hardcovers, and I do not typically read any audiobooks. I read no audiobooks in 2024. I just don't enjoy audiobooks as much, and I have a hard time focusing when that is my primary method of consuming a book. Yeah. My cat likes to play fetch. Okay, my highest and lowest average rated books on Goodreads. The highest rated book on Goodreads this year was Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson, which has a 4.76 average rating. That is bananas to have such a high rating, but absolutely deserves it, and this book made it into my top 10 of the year, so I absolutely think it is appropriately hyped. It deserves this super high rating. The lowest average rating on Goodreads of any book that I read this year was Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones, which only has a 3.33. And I have learned since being on BookTube that horror books are always rated low compared to most of the other genres that I read. I'm not really sure why that is. I think maybe people's horror taste is just very more finesse, I guess. But I had a good time with Night of the Mannequins. I think it definitely deserves higher than a 3.33. It wasn't a 5-star read for me, but it was a good time. Oldest book and newest book that I read this year. My oldest book was Don Quixote, which, as I mentioned, was published in the early 1600s. And then my newest book was When in Truth by Brandon Sanderson, which was just published in December. Longest book versus shortest book that I read this year. Once again, the longest book that I read was When in Truth by Brandon Sanderson, which is 1,344 pages. Holy moly. And the shortest book that I read was Only Dull People Are Brilliant at Breakfast by Oscar Wilde, which is not surprising. I thought this book was going to be a series of essays, but it turns out it's just a list of quotes that Oscar Wilde has said. So it was very, very short, but it was still a good read. She keeps bringing it back. Ready? Okay, as far as most mismatched ratings on Goodreads, the most overrated book that I read this year was definitely 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami, which does have an average rating on Goodreads of a 3.95. I think this book is trash. I gave it 1 star. I only read 200 pages of it before DNFing it, and I cannot believe that people like this book. So that is what it is. As far as my most underrated book, I gave We Spread by Ian Reid 5 stars, but it only has a 3.77 on Goodreads, which again, horror books, they're rated lowly for some reason, but We Spread definitely deserves a much higher rating than a 3.77. Come on. My most and least popular books according to the number of ratings that they have on Goodreads this year. My most popular book that I read was Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, which has been shelved 5.2 million times by Goodreads users. Holy moly. And the least popular book that I read this year is Reading Weather, which is a Falcon Guide by Jim Woodmansey. This is a little nonfiction book that I picked up at REI one time this year that is literally about like learning more about the weather, which I found super fascinating, but it doesn't surprise me that it's a very unpopular book on Goodreads. Last year, I tracked how much money I spent on books. I did not do that this year, unfortunately. That's something I'd like to start again in 2025, but I didn't spend very much, I know that. I only purchased 29 books in 2024, and of those, I read 14 of them in the same year that I purchased them in 2024. So I read 48% of the books that I purchased, which means I have 13 books that I need to read in 2025 that I purchased last year, which is one of my goals for 2025. If you want to see all of my goals for 2025, I will also link that video down below. And then into some of the Storygraph graphs, most of the books that I read were medium-paced books, 73%, and then 20% of the books that I read were fast-paced, which I think is probably because I read so many novellas this year, and then 7% were considered slow-paced books. As far as page number, 26% of the books that I read this year were over 500 pages, which I calculated this out earlier and I forgot to write it down, unfortunately, but I actually added up like all of the pages of all the books that I read that were over 500 pages divided by the number of total pages that I read according to Storygraph, and over 50% of my reading this year were books that were over 500 pages, which I found really interesting. But 26% of the books read, over 50% of the pages read, 500 plus pages, so I like them thick, what can I say? 34% of the books that I read were medium-sized books between 300 and 500 pages, and then 40% of the books that I read this year were short books, which is, again, not surprising because I read several novella series this year. My last stat that I have to share is just fiction versus nonfiction. I only read 8% nonfiction books this year, and 92% of the books that I read were fiction. That's not surprising. I would like my nonfiction reads to be around more like 10% of my total reads, but I just pick up nonfiction books and read them when they seem interesting, or I have something specific that I want to learn, or what have you. I don't usually build nonfiction books into my TBR the same way that I do fiction books, so it's not surprising that this number is so low. But anywho, that is everything you never wanted to know about all of the reads that I had in 2024. Here's hoping that 2025 is gonna have some more exciting stats. Of course it will. Let me know the most interesting stat that you have about your reads this year, or let me know just what you thought was the most interesting stat that I shared about my reads this year. If you're still here, thanks so much for watching and hanging out with me for a little bit today. Please be kind, read more books, and hit the subscribe button down below for more nerdy shit in the future. See you next time.